This program is narrated by Dan Fullenwider, who has led tours of Straight's Raid for many years. On several occasions, he was chosen as a tour guide for soldiers from Fort Knox, Kentucky, including troops from 27 different countries. Fullenwider has traveled on foot from the Mississippi state line to the Georgia state line, following the route of Straight's Raid across North Alabama. He has been awarded the prestigious Civil War Trust Chairman's Awards, recognizing his achievement in historic preservation for his work with the Civil War Trust in preserving endangered Civil War sites. After hearing of President Lincoln's assassination and the arrest of those conspiring against the president, Ohio Congressman James Garfield spoke of vengeance. "For mere vengeance I'd do nothing. This nation is too great to look for mere revenge. But for the security of the future, I would do everything," he said. Almost 20 years later, a mentally ill lawyer and Garfield supporter borrowed $15 and bought a pistol, seeking vengeance. President James Garfield had refused to give him an ambassadorship, so the 40-year-old lawyer began stalking him. In July of 1881, President James Garfield was shot and killed by the vengeful assassin. During the Civil War, revenge was quick or long in the making. Case in point was one of the most interesting characters to cross paths with Colonel Sleight, Aunt Jenny Brooks. 2 years before the raid even took place, Colonel Sleight was recruiting soldiers in Decatur, Alabama. In the spring of 1862, Sleight decided to send a foraging party south through Lawrence County. Food and horses were essential for his army. Riding down the Byler Road, the Union troops were ambushed by Confederate home guards, or militia. When the shooting stopped and the smoke cleared, 4 Union troops lay dead in the road. Nearby, Willis Brooks and his wife, Jenny, heard all the commotion and decided to investigate. Willis and 36-year-old Jenny weren't pacifists. They just didn't see any use in taking sides. Seeing the dead soldiers lying there, Jenny looked at her husband and said, "I can't stand to see them lie out there in the open, even if they are only Yankee soldiers." Willis wasn't eager to get involved, but Jenny continued, "Everyone deserves to be buried decent-like. We can't just leave them a-laying out there in the sun to rot." Willis wanted no part of it, but Jenny insisted and convinced their oldest son, John, to help her dig graves and bury the men. The neighbors, and especially Dr. Andrew Kaiser, who commanded the local militia, were not as sympathetic. After all, Willis was refusing to join the Confederate Army. Dr. Kaiser began to suspect the Brooks were helping the enemy, going so far as to call Willis a Union spy. Well, by the spring of 1864, emotions were running high, but food and grain were running low in the South, causing a toxic mixture between the Tories and Confederates in the northern hills of Alabama. Under the doctor's orders, Willis Brooks was taken from his home and shot by the Confederate Home Guard. When his body was brought home to Aunt Jenny, she was furious. Everyone knew it was bad business to cross the Brooks family. After all, Jenny had killed a man who had attempted to rape her daughter. But no one knew to what extent Aunt Jenny would go to settle the score. A few months later, one of the Brooks boys found Dr. Kaiser in his barn and shot him. Holding a gun to his wife's head, he forced her to name all those responsible for killing Willis Brooks. The list was made. Slowly but methodically, over the course of 20 years or so, the men were hunted down and killed. One of the men was tracked all the way to Oklahoma and shot. Family lore has it that Aunt Jenny set a new standard when she avenged the death of her husband by using the skull of one man for a soap dish. It had taken years, but Aunt Jenny had her revenge. In April of 1863, the Civil War was half over. At that point, it appeared that the Confederacy had the advantage. During the winter of 1862 and 63, there had been little military activity anywhere and no major battles. In the spring, the weather warmed, and several major cavalry excursions began.
We're into April and early May. At this time in the east, the Battle of Chancellorsville is raging. It's all battles in the Eastern Theater Command are well known, and of course in the Battle of Chancellorsville on the second day of May, Thomas Jonathan Jackson will be mortally wounded. So you've got the Battle of Chancellorsville in the east, and at Vicksburg, Grant is at critical moments during his Vicksburg campaign.
Among the Union raids was one that took place in North Alabama, known as Straight's Raid. The mission was led by Union Colonel Abel Sleight, a 33-year-old Indiana newspaper publisher. In the spring of 1863, General William S. Rosecrans, commanding Army of the Cumberland, wanted to lure Confederate General Braxton Bragg out of Tennessee and into Georgia. Rosecrans felt that if Bragg entrenched at the natural stronghold of Chattanooga, the Confederate general would cause him endless trouble. Rosecrans decided if he could secure the destruction of the important railroad leading from Chattanooga to Atlanta, he could destroy Bragg's supply lines and force the Confederacy south into Georgia. Colonel Sleight proposed a plan to Rosecrans' Chief of Staff, General James A. Garfield, who later was President of the United States. The plan was to lead an army across North Alabama Hill Country, where many Union sympathizers lived, and to destroy the railroad near Rome, Georgia. To sever this artery would cripple the Confederacy in Tennessee and force them to withdraw into Georgia. The plan was accepted by General James Garfield and General Rosecrans. This, then, is the story of Straight's Raid.
At Spring Hill, Tennessee, on the night of April 23rd, General Forrest received orders from General Braxton Bragg to leave Tennessee and come down to the North Alabama area to give Colonel Philip Dale Roddy support in his trying to stop the advance of the Union soldiers under Grenville Dodge from what they thought would be a crossing of North Alabama and toward the Decatur area. So at that point, General Forrest sent the 11th Tennessee under Colonel James Henry Edmondson down to the Tennessee River at Bainbridge to cross the river there and to join with Roddy in trying to halt the advance of General Dodge. Meanwhile, General Forrest marched from Spring Hill and arrived here at Brown's Ferry April 26th. He sent the 8th Tennessee under Colonel George Debrell down the north side of the river to Florence to make a lot of noise, a lot of commotion, to make General Dodge think that he was going to be flanked, with the hope that General Dodge would then return to Corinth. And another reason for sending him there was to prevent Dodge from crossing over to the north side of the river. And here on this historic road at Brown's Ferry, General Forrest crossed, marched his men up this road into Cortland, went on to Town Creek, and joined Roddy's forces and began skirmishing with General Dodge and trying to prevent Dodge from crossing Town Creek and continuing his march toward Decatur. And this road is one of the most historic in the state of Alabama. It was an ancient Indian trail and has a history going back far longer than the Civil War troops under General Forrest. After crossing Brown's Ferry on the Tennessee River, General Forrest marched on through Cortland toward Town Creek, where he rendezvoused with Roddy. In camp that night, on the night of the 27th, Roddy and Forrest made plans as how they wanted to deal with General Dodge the next day. And Forrest immediately sent Captain J.J. Scanlon across the Tennessee River in a canoe. The waters were choppy and treacherous, and Forrest ordered Scanlon to have Colonel George DeBrell and his 8th Tennessee to move downriver to Bainbridge, and ordered DeBrell to fire his artillery and cause such a commotion at Bainbridge that Dodge would think that he was going to cross the river and flank him in hopes that Dodge would retreat toward Corinth, Mississippi. Now, all day on the 28th of April, Dodge and Forrest skirmished at Town Creek. This was a ruse by Dodge just to keep Forrest occupied, to give Colonel Sleight time to put some distance between himself and the Confederates. On the night of the 28th, while they were camped near Town Creek, one of Roddy's scouts came into camp, notified General Forrest that a large body of Union troops were moving through Mount Hope toward Moulton. He said the number was approximately 2,000 troops, and Forrest immediately knew that something was going on in that area, and he decided that that should be the major point of his attention. Immediately, Forrest sent Roddy and the 11th Tennessee Cavalry from Cortland toward Moulton to try to place themselves between the troops of which turned out to be Colonel Sleight and the troops of General Dodge. And meanwhile, Forrest went back to Cortland, made preparations for pursuit. So General Forrest left Cortland at 1 o'clock in the morning on April 29th. At the same hour, Colonel Sleight left Moulton. Thus began the relentless pursuit of Colonel Sleight by General Forrest. And coming from Cortland to Moulton, General Forrest came down this very road. While they were in Moulton, that the troops of Colonel Sleight got a copy of an old newspaper article that had come out of the Moulton Advertiser, and in the article, the writers of the article said that the Yankees would not dare set foot in Moulton, and which the Union troops thought was hilarious at that time. And while they were in Moulton, they went to the jail, freed the prisoners that were there that were Union sympathizers, and left the prisoners in jail that were there for robbery or some other crime. And Sleight ordered his men to leave. They left here at 1 o'clock in the morning of April 29th, 1863, and began to trek toward Day's Gap. Ironically, at the same hour, 1 a.m., April 29th, General Forrest left Cortland and began to march toward Moulton. Arriving here the next day, they rested for an hour. At that point, General Forrest told his men, "Move up, men," and headed out on the road, Old Moulton to Danville Road, in pursuit of Colonel Sleight. Even today, as we walk up the old road bed that was once traveled by the Civil War troops of Forrest and Sleight, it's amazing to see that we still have remnants of old buildings. Old log cabin was here during the raid when the soldiers came down this very road. The old log cabin was here, and we wonder what the family thought as they heard the troops coming down this road at just past midnight on April 29th, 1863, 140 years ago. We know that a family was asleep, probably, was awakened by the troops, the sound of horses passing their house, the sound of movement, the sound of voices. And we're fortunate that we still have remnants that speaks of American history in our community today. On the night of April 29th, 1863, Colonel Straight's men arrived at this site. He was in the midst of friendly Union territory, and while they were camped here that night, this spot here was used as a campsite by many of the Union troops. And this spring was where they got their water source. And long before they were here, the Indians used this spring as a drinking water source, and they camped. This was an Indian campground here, we know, and they come down the old Indian trails here, the same trail that Colonel Straight's men went up when they left here, when Bill Forrest opened fire on them. And one can only imagine sitting here drinking coffee and realizing that in 1863 that many Union troops, young guys away from home, were here drinking coffee and eating around this same spring. This is the site of the old Penn cabin. Stephen Penn and his wife Hetty Day Penn owned this site. They were here. Hetty's father, David Day, came in here in the first couple of decades of the 1800s. You see the chimney site is all that's left of the old original cabin. But we know the cabin was built in 1819. And the Day Family Cemetery we'll visit shortly over on the hill tells a story of the early settlers of this area. Now when Strait arrived here on the night of April 29th of 63, the Penn family here had 3 sons, Richard, James, and Pleasant, that had joined the Union Army a year before in July of 1862 when Colonel Strait came into this valley and recruited troops from this area. Pleasant Penn had died earlier in February of 1863, and James was here with Colonel Strait when he arrived. And the soldiers were camped all over the Day and Penn locations, their plantations and farms, and Strait had all of his men all over this valley, from one spring here to the spring across the way. And we went down through the years, as people farmed and worked their crops, artifacts would appear. Here we have a piece of an axle off of one of Colonel Straight's supply wagons. We know that Colonel Strait camped near the springs in this area, put his supply wagons, and on the morning of April 30th, the 2 Alabama companies were saying goodbye to their friends and relatives. Colonel Strait had already moved on up the mountain, and while they were taking their time, saying their goodbyes and having breakfast and actually cooking breakfast, Bill Forrest opened fire on them, and immediately the Union troops began moving up the mountain to rejoin Colonel Strait. At that point, the Confederate soldiers began eating some of the breakfast that the Union troops had actually cooked, and then they burned some of the supply wagons. And here we have part of an axle from one of Colonel Straight's supply wagons. Here we have a coffee grinder, piece of a coffee grinder, may have come off the same wagon. We don't know, but it was located in this area, and it tells a story of Union troops that were here camping, cooking, living as best they could on a Civil War campaign. Other artifacts from all over this area, the battleground on top of the mountain, other places in this area, are Civil War bullets, Confederate bullets, what we call Union 3 ring. Here we have Union coat eagle buttons. We have a Confederate coin buttons, 58 caliber bullets, grape shot from all around this area. The Penn family were like many other families during the war from this area. They sent their boys to war and had some die. It was a suffering all across the nation in the war between the states. Every family practically suffered, and we're in the midst of a very historic part of that war. Here we have what was probably the old smokehouse of the Day family and the Penn family. This is built about the same time that the old log cabin was in 1819. It's one of the most ancient buildings standing today in Morgan County, and it was used for many years. And this is an example of what was the early settlers of Alabama built and used. It tells us a part of the history of the area and the type of buildings that was used by the very first settlers of our area. When Colonel Sleight arrived here with his men, he was feeling very good about his situation, his progress so far during the campaign. Coming from Moulton, he had managed to overtake a lot of wagons and supplies where people had heard a Union army coming through, so they headed out of Moulton trying to evade the army. Sleight caught up with them, managed to get mounts for all of his men, and by the time he was arrived here in this valley at the Day and Penn farms, he was in good spirits. A lot of his men had been recruited from here, the Days, Penns, Gibsons, Turrentines. The boys were all grandsons of old David Day, the early settler here, and Day's Gap, and the Day Gap Road's named for him. And two of the men here was Nee Smith and William Guthrie. William Alexander Nee Smith, called Uncle Buck, he was my great-great-grandmother's brother. He was here, and in later years he visited the home of the Guthrie family, some of them, and was telling about his experiences and Bill Guthrie's experiences here, camped at Day's Gap. And his granddaughter, Vera Hale, told me the story and told about how old Buck was laughing, said when he got here it was sort of boring to him. He told his friend Guthrie, said, "Guthrie, I'd like to see some action taking place. I'm bored." Well, it wasn't long before Bill Forrest opened fire on the Union troops here, and Nee Smith said he had all the action he needed, and he and Guthrie remained lifelong friends. And later in 1864, Guthrie, Nee Smith, and the 1st Alabama Union Cavalry, which included the 2 companies of Middle Tennessee Cavalry that was here, accompanied General William T. Sherman on his famous March to the Sea. But behind us in this valley, on that night, there were campfires all over. There were families coming out to see their sons and their friends and relatives. Some of them had lost relatives earlier in the war, and they were not able to be here with them. But this valley was filled with troops. It was filled with homecoming. Many of them had been away for a long period of time. They caught up on the news and were told about the deaths of some of their grandparents and other family members. But all that changed on the morning of April 30th, the next morning. Troops of Colonel Sleight were camped all across this field, all the way from the pen cabin where we were earlier, all the way to this site. Her brother Richard Day lived here. The old cabin stood at this side, and the old chimney rock is still visible if you were to walk into this clump of vines. And Hetty and Richard were brother and sister. They were the children of old David Day, the original pioneer. And it was at the Day cabin was also used as a field hospital after the battle. And it was at this site that John Bird Dunn came and looked inside of Richard Day's old barn through a crack in one of the stables and saw crude battlefield surgery where one of the soldiers had his leg amputated with a handsaw.
Our brave wounded cannot be left to the cruelties of an ignoble foe. Their mangled limbs must be amputated and their bleeding wounds dressed. I am left behind for this purpose, and thus at Sand Mountain on the 30th of April, 1863, in a sparsely settled country, in the thick forest and mountains of an inveterate foe, I find myself a prisoner. With what varying emotions of trepidation and hope do I now contemplate my situation. Those brave and noble companions of my brigade, with whom I have endured so many hardships, and upon whose brawny arms and stalwart frames I have heretofore relied for protection, have gone, and I find myself surrounded by a mongrel set of armed men, rude and illiterate, who taunt and jeer me for my devotion to my country and its honor. While their companions rob our wounded and strip our dead, scores of rude questions are asked me at the same time. Roughly and eagerly, my captors, the chivalrous Southerner, now take possession of my revolver, horse and blankets, a portion of my medicines and instruments, while one rude fellow and then another will claim my boots as his meat, another my hat. So with my watch, money, pocket knife, and in fact, everything their curiosity or avarice took a notion to, if found on my person. Captain William Spencer, Surgeon, United States Army.
For 8 days, the wounded lay out just under the sun, and whatever rain came by, there was no shelter. The Confederates took virtually all of the rations that had been left by the other parts of the brigade. And what they did, eventually the Confederate guards took off, and that left the Union soldiers, the wounded soldiers, ready to be evacuated someplace. So the people who were the Union sympathizers, the Southern loyalists, began to pick out these soldiers, and one soldier would go to one house, two soldiers would go to another house, and depending on how much room in houses and depending on the severity of the wounds, they would split these people up, the soldiers up, and let the nursing be done not by any military force but just by the women in the homes.
During the Civil War, when they had, I guess they were soldiers in a hospital cabin, Miss Mattie Dobbs, who was, she was older than I was, but she said her mother was one of the ones that took food. I suppose several or different people in the community would take turns taking food up there to what they call the hospital. And she said her mother had a small child, and she would put that small child on a horse and ride that horse to Days Gap, which was several miles, and take her food and help take care of the people there, even with her small child. So if she did, I'm sure a lot of other women in the community took turns doing the same thing.
There were 4 amputations, one a double amputation, that were done by Spencer, and all 4 lived. Matter of fact, 2 of them showed up at a reunion in 1920, and one man who lost his left arm right at the shoulder and his right hand, the surgeons in the Union hospitals built him a thumb so that he would have some gripping capacity for that hand. He was married, raised 4 children, and died when he was 86 years old.
So on this side here, there was a lot of suffering, a lot of pain took place, and the Day family was agreeable to treat the soldiers as best they could with their primitive conditions and their medicines. The old Day family cemetery, later called the Spiegel Cemetery, tells the story of the early history of this area. Many of the people buried in this cemetery were early settlers and sons and grandchildren of the early settler David Day. Old David Day, buried here, was the first settler in this area. The Day Gap Road and Days Gap is named after him, and Day Gap Road runs across the entire Coleman County. And he came in here in the early 1800s, built an old log cabin. One cabin we know had 1819 on one of the rocks, and he died in 1862, and 2 of his grandsons, the Day boys, no doubt was told by their father Richard Day, is buried here. Richard's cabin stood for several years in this valley, and Richard was living there when Sleight came through. His 2 sons were recruited by Colonel Sleight in July of 1862 when Sleight made a recruiting trip into this valley. Chris Sheets made a speech here at the Day home and helped recruit the boys and told them that tomorrow I'll go join the Union Army. Sheets never did join the Union Army, but it was Winston County's representative to Montgomery, and he was jailed for his refusal to back secession and his Union stand. The Day family were like many others in North Alabama. They lived in the hills, and most of the people in the North Alabama hills were poor farmers. They did their best to eke out a living, working their land. Few people owned slaves, and they thought it was a rich man's war and a poor man's fight, so they wanted to stay out of the war. And in 1862, when Alabama passed the Conscription Act, forcing every able-bodied man between 18 and 35 to join the Confederate Army, that's when you had an exodus of people from this area. And what is Winston County today, Marion County, Blount County, Coleman County, Morgan County, went to Decatur and Huntsville to join the Union Army. They were forced to take a stand, and many of them took a stand with the Union. And one reason that this area was such a strong Union area was because many of Andrew Jackson's troops came into this area after the Creek Indian War. They had served under General Jackson. They were strong Jackson supporters, and Jackson was a Union man. A prime example is old Solomon Curtis from Winston County. On his deathbed in 1860, he called his sons around his bedside and told them made them promise to not take up arms against the flag. And Thomas Pinckney Curtis Probate judge of Winston County was killed in 1864 for his stand, and another brother, Joel Curtis, was killed in 1862, and a third brother, George Washington Curtis, was killed in 1863, shot off his horse in his front yard as his wife Ora and 3 children looked on. So the Union people of North Alabama felt strongly for the Union and the cause for which General Jackson had fought.
So there's a lot more people fought in the Union Army from Alabama than people are aware of. And it's a myth that the South was solid. The South was not solid, particularly in the hill country of North Alabama. People up here didn't own slaves, they didn't own plantation, they did not have a lot of cotton, they did not have large land holdings.
The Harper's Weekly ran a front page, a full spread illustration about how the people in the mountains of Alabama were rushing to the Tennessee River to express sympathy to the Union cause. So you had a great deal of stir going on, and Sleight thought that a raid could be staged in Alabama that would have a tremendous psychological effect. At the same time, they could go to Rome, Georgia, and then on over to the main railroad line and play havoc there that would damage the support the Confederate Army under Lee was receiving in the eastern part of the Confederacy.
Now here in the lower part of the cemetery are the graves of 6 of the Civil War troops killed in the Battle of Days Gap. Now, there were many wounded in the battle, and they were scattered around to different homes and cared for until they recuperated. 16-year-old Thursa Penn, the daughter of Hetty Penn, remembers seeing 6 of the soldiers buried in this cemetery. She was there when they were buried, saw their bodies, and they're just here for eternity. And the families probably never knew where they were at. There were 6 boys who left home to fight in a war, and families never saw them again. And that happened so much during the war. And it was just heartbreaking to families all across both North and South.